The engine of Eric's old sedan purred softly as he parked across the street from the unfamiliar building. Its stark industrial design was a sharp contrast to the cozy suburban neighborhood he called home. He checked his watch. 8:32 p.m. Rachel's excuses about a late work meeting still rang in his ears, but the unease in his chest had grown unbearable. For months, her absences had become more frequent, her explanations thinner, her warmth dimmer. Tonight, the fragile thread of trust that had tethered his heart to hers felt dangerously close to snapping. Eric had tried to push his suspicions aside, clinging to the hope that his intuition was wrong. After all, Rachel had been his anchor, his confidant, the woman he'd built a life with for over a decade. Yet, the shadow of doubt loomed large, cast by late-night phone calls cut short when he entered the room, and the faint traces of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a small notebook and pen. These tools of precision, remnants from his days as an architect, were meant to capture fleeting details, to reconstruct moments when emotions threatened to blur the truth. His hand trembled slightly as he jotted down the address, already committing the space to memory. Through the rain-speckled windshield, Eric watched as the door of the building opened. Rachel stepped out, her blonde hair catching the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. She wasn't alone. The man beside her was taller, broad-shouldered, and exuding a casual confidence that made Eric's stomach churn. It was Tom, her colleague, the one she'd always dismissed as just a work friend. Eric's grip tightened on the notebook, the pressure creasing the paper beneath his hand. He could feel the sting of betrayal slicing through his chest, but he forced himself to remain still. Confrontation now would mean letting his emotions dictate the narrative. He needed clarity, undeniable proof. The pair walked down the short path to a black SUV, their conversation muted by the sound of the rain. Rachel laughed, a carefree, melodic sound Eric hadn't heard in months. It pierced through him, rekindling memories of when that laughter was reserved for him alone. He watched as she leaned into Tom, her body language unmistakably intimate. Tom opened the passenger door for her, and she slid inside with a fluidity that spoke of familiarity. Eric's mind raced. He had seen enough to confirm his suspicions, yet questions gnawed at him. How long had this been going on? What had driven Rachel to this point? And perhaps the hardest to face, had there been signs he had willfully ignored? Yes. On a previous visit to my office, Henry had taken the time to review. As the SUV pulled away, Eric started the car, his mind already devising the next steps. He would follow them, not to confront them, but to gather the evidence he needed. He wasn't acting out of spite or vengeance. It was about knowing the truth and regaining control of a life that suddenly felt like a house built on sand. By the time Eric reached his house, it was nearly midnight. He parked in the driveway, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. Inside, the home he'd lovingly built with Rachel felt hollow. The photographs on the walls, the shared mementos, the echo of laughter, all seemed like artifacts from a life that no longer existed. Eric sat at the dining table, the notebook before him. He began writing down everything he had seen and felt, each word grounding him in the reality he was struggling to accept. This was just the beginning. Tomorrow he would speak to Emma, his closest friend and confidant, to help him plan his next move. For now, he let the silence envelop him, a quiet storm brewing in his heart. The morning sun streamed through the living room windows, casting warm light on the photographs that lined the mantel, snapshots of a life that now felt like a cruel joke. Eric sat at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee as it grew cold. He hadn't slept. Instead, he'd spent the night reviewing the details he'd meticulously written in his notebook, each line an indictment of Rachel's betrayal. There was no denying it now. The truth stared him in the face, demanding action. But action required a plan. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts, landing on Emma's name. She was the one person who would listen without judgment, the one person who had always been a source of steady advice in times of turmoil. "Eric, you sound awful," Emma said after answering on the second ring. "Can we talk?" His voice cracked, betraying the weight of his emotions. Half an hour later, Emma arrived, carrying a bag of fresh bagels and an expression that combined concern and readiness. She listened as Eric recounted the events of the previous night, her expression darkening with each detail. "I knew something was off," Emma said, setting her coffee down with a decisive thud. "Remember last month at the barbecue?" Rachel was glued to her phone, and when I asked her about it, she brushed me off. "That's not like her." Eric nodded, his mind flashing back to the barbecue. Rachel had been distant, excusing herself repeatedly to take calls. At the time, he dismissed it as work stress. Now, he felt foolish for not pressing her further. "We need to be smart about this," Emma said. "Rushing in without all the facts could backfire. If she denies it, she'll twist the narrative and make you the bad guy. You need evidence, Eric, not just for your peace of mind, but in case things get ugly." Emma's words struck a chord. He had seen enough last night to know something was going on, but hearsay and suspicion wouldn't hold up in the storm that was likely to follow. He needed proof, concrete, undeniable proof that Rachel couldn't refute. "I've already started keeping notes," Eric said, holding up the notebook. "But I need more." Emma leaned back, her brow furrowed in thought. "Do you know someone who could help? A private investigator, maybe?" The idea hadn't occurred to Eric, but it made sense. A professional could provide the kind of evidence Rachel couldn't dismiss as paranoia or overreaction. "That's not a bad idea," Eric said. "I'll look into it." He hung up. The conversation shifted to strategy. Emma suggested keeping a close eye on Rachel's behavior, noting patterns, and avoiding confrontations until he had all the pieces of the puzzle. Eric scribbled down her suggestions, grateful for her calm, methodical approach. That evening, Rachel came home later than usual. She was in high spirits, humming a tune Eric didn't recognize as she hung her coat by the door. "Long day?" Eric asked, masking the tension in his voice with a smile. "Exhausting," Rachel said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "But productive." Eric studied her as she spoke, searching for cracks in her facade. She was animated, her words flowing with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed their story. He nodded along, careful not to betray his inner turmoil. Over the next few days, Eric began to notice more inconsistencies. Rachel's explanations for her absences became increasingly vague. She spent more time on her phone, often retreating to another room to take calls. Once, he caught her hastily shutting her laptop when he entered the room, her face flushed with what could only be guilt. Eric took note of it all, each detail reinforcing his resolve. He contacted a private investigator recommended by Emma and arranged a discreet meeting. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Marlene, assured him that she would uncover the truth. "The key is patience," Marlene said, sliding a business card across the table. "These things take time. You'll get what you need, but you have to let me do my job." Patience was a virtue Eric had always struggled with, but for this he knew he had no choice. He spent the following weeks in a state of quiet observation, letting Rachel believe that her charade was intact. The waiting was agonizing, but it gave him time to prepare. For the confrontation, for the fallout, for the life he would have to rebuild from the ashes of this betrayal. Each evening, Eric stared out the window of his office, the city lights a blur against the backdrop of his thoughts. Rachel was slipping further away, her secrets creating an unbridgeable chasm between them. But he wouldn't let her lies define his future. The truth was coming, and when it arrived, it would shatter the fragile illusion Rachel had built. Eric sat in his office late at night, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. On his laptop screen, Marlene's latest report blinked into existence. It was comprehensive. Times, photographs, and notes about Rachel's clandestine meetings with Tom. Eric's stomach churned as he scrolled through the evidence. The first photo hit him the hardest. Rachel and Tom sitting in a secluded corner of a restaurant. Her hand rested lightly on his, her face illuminated with the same carefree smile she'd once reserved for Eric. He clicked through more photos. Rachel entering Tom's apartment building late at night, her blonde hair glowing under the dim streetlights. Tom holding the door open for her with a grin that made Eric's fists clench. Marlene's notes left no room for doubt. The affair was real, ongoing, and brazenly casual. Eric closed the laptop with a heavy sigh, his heart a mix of anguish and simmering anger. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't paralyzing. He was ready to act. The next morning, Eric decided to visit Emma. He needed her perspective now more than ever. She greeted him at the door with a warm hug, her usual no-nonsense demeanor tempered by genuine concern. "I assume you've seen the report," she asked, leading him into her small but cozy living room. "I have." Eric sat down, rubbing his temples. "It's worse than I imagined." Emma handed him a mug of coffee. "So, what's your next move?" Eric hesitated, staring into the dark liquid. "I've thought about confronting her immediately, but Marlene advised against it. She said rushing in without a plan could give Rachel an opportunity to twist the narrative." Emma nodded. "She's right. Rachel's clearly skilled at covering her tracks. And Tom? Well, I doubt he'd hesitate to back her up if it meant saving his own skin." Eric clenched his jaw. "It's not just the betrayal that bothers me, Emma. It's the sheer audacity of it. The lies, the deception, the way she's made me feel like I'm the one who's lost touch." Emma placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's why you need to be smart about this. Take control of the situation, but don't let anger cloud your judgment." Eric nodded, his resolve hardening. He spent the next few days meticulously planning his confrontation. With Emma's help, he compiled Marlene's evidence into a file that left no room for argument. He also prepared emotionally, rehearsing what he would say and how he would respond to Rachel's inevitable denials and justifications. The confrontation took place on a Friday evening. Rachel arrived home late again, her excuse predictably vague. Eric waited for her in the living room, the evidence file resting on the coffee table. He felt a strange calm wash over him as she entered the room, her cheerful demeanor faltering when she saw his expression. "Eric?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "What's going on?" "Sit down," he said, his tone firm but measured. Rachel hesitated, then complied, perching on the edge of the sofa like a child called into the principal's office. Eric slid the file across the table. "Open it." Her hands trembled slightly as she complied. The color drained from her face as she flipped through the photos and notes. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with fear and guilt. "Eric, I can explain." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her attempt at damage control. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending there's an explanation for this." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lonely, and Tom, he was just there. I never stopped loving you, Eric. I swear." "Loving me?" Eric's voice rose, his calm facade beginning to crack. "You call this love? Sneaking around, lying to my face, throwing away 12 years of marriage for... what? A thrill?" Rachel's tears fell freely now, but Eric felt no sympathy. "I know I made a mistake, but it doesn't have to end like this. We can work through it, Eric. Please." He shook his head, the pain in his chest replaced by a cold finality. "You made your choice, Rachel. You chose lies over honesty, betrayal over loyalty. There's no coming back from this." Rachel sobbed, her hands clutching the file as if it were her lifeline. "What about us? What about everything we've built together?" Eric stood, his expression resolute. "You destroyed that the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." He walked to the door, his back to Rachel as he delivered his final words. "You can stay here tonight, but I want you out by the weekend. I'll be filing for divorce on Monday. That night, Eric slept on the couch, his heart heavy, but his mind at peace. The confrontation had been painful, but it was also liberating. He had faced the truth, taken control, and set the course for a new chapter in his life. As he stared at the ceiling, the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains, Eric allowed himself to feel a sliver of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was also a chance to rebuild, a chance to find happiness on his own terms. For the first time in months, Eric felt like he was no longer living in the shadows of Rachel's lies. The veil had fallen, and the truth had set him free. The days after the confrontation were a strange mix of quiet and chaos for Eric. The stillness of the house without Rachel's presence was almost unnerving. Yet beneath it bubbled the undercurrent of rapid change. True to his word, Eric had filed for divorce on Monday morning. He felt a strange sense of relief handing the papers to the clerk, a small but decisive step toward reclaiming his life. By midweek, Rachel had moved out, leaving behind only a hollow echo of the life they had built together. Eric stood in the living room, staring at the bare patches on the walls where her favorite photos had once hung. The emptiness felt daunting, but it also offered a strange sense of possibility. Eric busied himself with practical matters, updating bank accounts, securing his finances, and changing the locks. Each task felt like a piece of armor, shielding him from the rawness of what had happened. His resolve to rebuild, however, didn't stop the occasional pangs of sadness or moments of doubt. He spent hours replaying conversations in his head, wondering if there had been a way to stop Rachel's betrayal before it spiraled so completely out of control. It was during one of these reflective moments that Emma called. "Hey?" she said, her voice warm but cautious. "How are you holding up?" Eric hesitated. "Some days are easier than others. I'm trying to focus on what's next, but..." He trailed off, not needing to finish the thought. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Emma said. "But I was thinking, why not get out of the house for a bit? It's not healthy to keep staring at the walls. There's a small art exhibit opening downtown this weekend. Let's go. It'll be good to do something different." Eric was about to decline, but he caught himself. Emma was right. He had spent too much time alone in the house, dwelling on the past. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." The art exhibit turned out to be a surprisingly cathartic experience. The gallery buzzed with quiet energy, the kind of hum that only comes from people immersed in creativity. Eric found himself drawn to a series of abstract paintings, their chaotic brushstrokes mirroring the turmoil he felt inside. "Art imitates life, huh?" Emma said, appearing beside him. Eric chuckled. "Something like that." They wandered through the gallery, stopping occasionally to admire a piece or exchange observations. For the first time in weeks, Eric felt a sense of normality, a reminder that life could exist outside the shadow of betrayal. Over dinner afterward, Emma brought up the future. "So, have you thought about what's next?" she asked. Eric sighed. "Honestly, I've been so focused on handling the divorce and getting through each day that I haven't had much time to think beyond that." "Well," Emma said, "maybe it's time to start. What about your work? You've been in that same job for years. Do you still feel passionate about it?" Eric shrugged. He had always enjoyed his work as an architect, but the past year had dulled his enthusiasm. "I don't know. Maybe a change wouldn't be the worst thing." He looked down at the dashboard. Emma leaned forward, her eyes alight with encouragement. "Then do it. Take a risk. You've got a chance to reinvent yourself, Eric. Don't let this opportunity slip away." Her words lingered with Eric over the next few days. He began to look at his life through a different lens, reevaluating what truly mattered. Slowly but surely, he began to take steps toward rediscovery. He reconnected with an old colleague, Jonathan, who had started a boutique architecture firm specializing in sustainable design. Over coffee, Jonathan spoke passionately about their latest projects, creating environmentally friendly spaces that blended form and function. "We're always looking for talented designers," Jonathan said, his tone half joking but entirely sincere. Eric smiled. "I'll think about it." At home, Eric turned his focus inward. He dusted off his sketch pad and began drawing again, something he hadn't done in years. At first, the lines felt awkward, the images hesitant. But as he continued, the sketches grew bolder, more intricate. The act of creating something tangible felt like a balm to his soul. He also started therapy, encouraged by Emma's gentle nudging. Talking to a professional helped him unpack the layers of betrayal and loss, but it also gave him tools to rebuild his self-esteem and redefine his goals. One evening, as Eric sat in his newly arranged office, free of Rachel's clutter but filled with his sketches and notes, he realized he was beginning to feel a glimmer of hope. The pain of Rachel's betrayal hadn't vanished, but it no longer consumed him. It was becoming a part of his story, not the defining chapter. On a crisp Saturday morning, Eric returned to the gallery alone. The abstract paintings that had captivated him during his first visit now felt different. Where before they had mirrored his chaos, now they seemed to represent transformation, a messy but necessary process of growth. As he left the gallery, the sun breaking through the clouds, Eric felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He was still healing, still learning, but he was moving forward. Rachel's betrayal had shattered the life he knew, but it had also cleared the way for something new, something he was just beginning to glimpse. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eric felt like he was standing on solid ground. The seasons had begun to change. The once vibrant greens of the trees lining Eric's neighborhood had softened to hues of gold and amber. It had been several months since the divorce was finalized, and while the paperwork marked a definitive end, Eric knew the journey of rebuilding himself was still ongoing. Yet, for the first time, the weight on his chest felt lighter. Eric stood in his backyard, sipping a cup of coffee as the crisp morning air filled his lungs. The yard, which had once been neglected in the chaos of his crumbling marriage, was now neatly trimmed, the flower beds alive with bursts of color. He had poured his energy into the space, finding solace in its transformation. It wasn't just a yard, it was a reflection of his own renewal. The weeks following Rachel's departure had been a whirlwind of adjustments. There were practicalities to handle, splitting finances, dividing possessions. But the most challenging part had been re-establishing a sense of identity outside of his role as a husband. The quietness of the house, once a painful reminder of what he had lost, had become a source of peace. With Emma's persistent encouragement, Eric had taken a leap of faith and joined Jonathan's architecture firm. The transition had been invigorating. Gone were the days of designing uninspired corporate buildings. Now, Eric worked on projects that aligned with his values, creating spaces that were not only functional but environmentally conscious. Each completed design felt like a personal victory, a testament to his ability to start anew. But Eric's growth wasn't limited to his career. Therapy had helped him navigate the labyrinth of emotions left in the wake of Rachel's betrayal. Through those sessions, he'd come to understand that the failure of his marriage wasn't solely his burden to carry. He began to shed the guilt that had clung to him, replacing it with a sense of self-compassion he hadn't known he needed. One of his breakthroughs came during a session where he was asked to describe the version of himself he wanted to be, independent of his past. Eric had paused, struggling to articulate his answer. But as the words began to flow, he realized he wanted to be someone who wasn't defined by fear of betrayal, fear of being alone. Our winter's behavior gave him anchors to his past, reminding him that he was not alone. In embracing that ideal, Eric started taking risks, not reckless ones, but calculated steps toward a fuller life. He signed up for a pottery class, an activity that had intrigued him since college, but always seemed impractical. He was terrible at first, his hands clumsy with the wet clay. But the process became meditative. The bowls and vases he created weren't perfect, but they were uniquely his. The class also brought new connections. One evening, while struggling to shape a particularly stubborn piece of clay, a woman at the next wheel chuckled softly. "Don't fight it," she said, her eyes sparkling with humor. "The clay always wins." Her name was Clara, a sculptor with a quick wit and a warm presence. Their conversation started as casual banter but grew deeper over time. Clara's outlook on life was refreshing. She saw beauty in imperfection and value in vulnerability. They began meeting for coffee after class, their discussions flowing easily from art to philosophy to life's twists and turns. Eric was cautious, but for the first time in a long while he felt a spark of something unfamiliar yet welcome. He wasn't rushing into anything. He had learned the importance of patience and self-awareness. But with Clara, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. One evening, as Eric stood in his transformed backyard, he reflected on how far he had come. He thought about Rachel, not with anger, but with a quiet acceptance. Her betrayal had been devastating, but it had also forced him to confront parts of himself he might have otherwise ignored. In many ways, her actions had been a catalyst for the life he was now building. Emma stopped by later that night, carrying a bottle of wine. They sat by the fire pit Eric had built, the flames dancing between them. "You seem different," Emma said, her eyes studying him. "Lighter," Eric smiled. "I think I am. It's strange, but as much as I hated everything that happened, I'm grateful for what it's taught me. I'm learning to let go of what I can't control and focus on what I can." Emma raised her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings." Eric clinked his glass against hers, the sound crisp and clear in the cool night air. For the first time in months, he felt truly present, untethered from the pain of the past. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, memories that stung. But he also knew he was stronger now, ready to face whatever came next. The stars above shimmered faintly, a quiet reminder of the vastness of possibility. Eric tilted his head back and smiled, embracing the unknown with open arms.